In 1970, $12 million vanished from Chicago in a single night. No alarms, no witnesses, no mistakes. At least that's what everyone thought. Decades later, investigators uncovered a trail of secrets that revealed just how the impossible heist was carried out, and why the money never resurfaced. In the long, sweltering summer of 1976, when Florida was still caught between the fading glow of post-war prosperity and the creeping shadows of inflation, racial tension, and the disillusionment of Watergate, a crime unfolded that would haunt both law enforcement and the communities of the Gulf Coast for decades. The city of Tampa, with its humid nights and restless streets lined with neon-lit diners, truck depots, and banks designed in mid-century concrete minimalism, became the backdrop for one of the boldest heists in American banking history. At the center of it all stood the First National Bank of Florida, a squat white building with tinted glass windows and a reinforced steel vault said to be impenetrable. The bank sat at the corner of Nebraska Avenue and East Harrison Street, directly across from a small grocery store and a tire shop. By day, delivery trucks and sedans crowded the parking lot, and by night, the area felt deserted except for the occasional patrol car or a pair of teenagers sneaking into the alley to drink beer. On paper, the bank's defenses were airtight. A reinforced alarm system tied directly to the Tampa Police Department, security cameras mounted at every entrance, and armed guards rotating shifts around the vault. Yet on the morning of July 9, 1976, $8.2 million in cash, an almost unimaginable sum at the time, vanished without a single shot fired, leaving behind more questions than answers. Investigators would later describe the heist as surgical, a crime that looked less like an act of desperation and more like a carefully executed military operation. The roots of the crime stretched back months, if not years. The man credited by some as the architect of the heist was Thomas Brennan, a 42-year-old ex-Marine turned truck dispatcher. Brennan was the kind of man who disappeared into a crowd, short-cropped brown hair, a permanent squint from years in the Florida sun, and a habit of speaking only when necessary. He had served in Vietnam, where he had learned not only the art of logistics but the patience of waiting for the right moment to strike. Returning home, he found himself trapped in the monotony of civilian life, his modest salary barely covering his mortgage and the mounting medical bills from his wife's illness. By 1975, his bitterness had grown into something darker. Friends recalled him staring off into space at bars, tapping his fingers against the counter as if rehearsing an invisible plan. He was always calculating, one coworker later told investigators. Like he was waiting for a puzzle piece to fall into place. That piece arrived in the form of an insider. Bank employee Harold Hal Peterson, 33, worked the night shift overseeing armored truck deliveries and vault inventory. Divorced, perpetually broke, and drowning in gambling debts owed to bookies in Miami, Peterson had reached a breaking point by early 1976. His role granted him access to detailed shipment schedules, codes, and security routines. Through a series of late-night bar conversations with Brennan, where cheap whiskey dulled his judgment and loosened his tongue, Peterson gradually revealed the vulnerabilities of the First National Bank. When the alarms were most likely to be disabled for maintenance, how often the guards rotated, and, most importantly, that a massive transfer of cash from the Federal Reserve in Atlanta was scheduled to pass through Tampa in July, temporarily stored in the vault for less than 48 hours, before being moved south. It was like dangling meat in front of a starving dog, Brennan later confessed to a cellmate years down the line. But even with insider knowledge, pulling off a heist of this magnitude required precision and discipline. Brennan began recruiting. His second-in-command was Richard "Rick" Callahan, 38, a former construction foreman and part-time mechanic who had lost his pension after a bitter union dispute. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of quiet menace that drew respect, Callahan became the muscle of the operation. Then came Miguel Ortiz, 29, a Cuban-born locksmith whose skills with safes and locks were legendary in the Miami underworld. Ortiz had fled Havana with his family as a child and grown up in the backstreets of Little Havana, where he picked locks to survive before graduating to more lucrative targets. Each man brought a different strength, but all shared the same desperation, the same gnawing belief that the system had failed them and that fortune had to be seized, not earned. Planning began in January of 1976. The group rented a garage in Ybor City under the guise of operating a small delivery company. Inside, they mapped the bank's floor plan on the concrete wall using chalk, marking guard stations, entry points, and the vault's reinforced layers. Peterson provided them with access codes written on napkins, smuggled copies of delivery logs, and even rough sketches of the vault interior. They rehearsed scenarios over and over. What if a guard entered unexpectedly? What if the alarm tripped? What if the police arrived within 5 minutes? Every possibility was considered. They purchased 2 panel vans, one white and one blue, registered under false names, and stocked them with tools ranging from welding torches to uniforms that mimicked those of Brink's truck drivers. The plan hinged on deception, not violence. They would impersonate delivery men, access the vault during a scheduled transfer, and remove the money before anyone realized what had happened. The morning of July 9th began like any other. Florida heat already shimmered off the asphalt by 7 a.m., and the cicadas buzzed like static from the oak trees. Inside the bank, Peterson feigned routine exhaustion as he signed off on paperwork and greeted the 2 guards on duty. The vault held exactly $8.2 million in bundled cash, stacked neatly in canvas bags weighing nearly 40 pounds each. The shipment was scheduled to be moved south by 11 a.m., but between 8 o'clock and 10 o'clock, the vault would be briefly accessible for auditing, a window Brennan and his crew had been waiting for. At 8:15, a blue panel van pulled into the service entrance, its side emblazoned with the Brinks logo crudely stenciled on. Security footage would later show the van idling for exactly 47 seconds before the back doors opened and 2 men in Brinks uniforms stepped out, clipboards in hand. To the untrained eye, they looked indistinguishable from legitimate drivers. To Peterson, watching from the inside, they were salvation. The heist unfolded with eerie calm. Callahan and Ortiz entered, nodding casually to the guard at the door, handing over forged delivery slips that bore authentic serial numbers Peterson had stolen weeks earlier. The guard barely looked at them. He had seen a dozen such transfers before. Once inside the vault chamber, Peterson triggered a minor electrical glitch in the alarm system, simulating what appeared to be a routine malfunction. In those 60 seconds of downtime, Ortiz worked swiftly, removing the protective latches and securing the bags of cash onto a dolly. Each bag weighed nearly 40 pounds, and together they loaded over 200 of them in less than 15 minutes, moving like shadows. It was mechanical, Peterson later admitted, like watching gears turn. By 8:37 a.m., the men had wheeled the last of the bags into the van, closing the doors softly. The guard at the entrance signed the clipboard, oblivious, and the van rolled away, merging into morning traffic as though nothing had happened. No alarms blared, no shots were fired, and no one in the bank realized the money was gone until 2 hours later when the legitimate Brinks truck arrived to collect the shipment. By then, Brennan and his crew had already vanished. News of the heist spread across Tampa like wildfire. Local radio stations interrupted programming to announce the largest bank theft in Florida history. The Tampa Tribune ran the headline in bold letters the next morning: 8 million vanishes in daylight robbery. Reporters camped outside the bank, snapping photographs of the stunned guards and confused employees. It was like someone had stolen the sun right out of the sky, one journalist wrote. The FBI was called in within hours, treating the case as a federal emergency. "We are dealing with professionals," Special Agent Walter Kruger told reporters. This was no smash and grab. This was orchestrated with precision. For Brennan, however, the euphoria of success was already curdling into paranoia. Hidden in a rented farmhouse 20 miles north of Tampa, the crew unloaded the bags into a false wall behind the barn. Brennan insisted on silence, forbidding phone calls, visits, or even leaving the property for the first 72 hours. Each man stared at the mountain of cash, bundles marked with crisp Federal Reserve seals, their green edges gleaming in the dim light. For a moment they felt untouchable. Yet the weight of what they had done pressed down on them. Ortiz, pacing back and forth, muttered in Spanish about the danger of betrayal. Callahan smoked endlessly, his hands trembling as he lit cigarette after cigarette. Peterson drank himself into a stupor, convinced the FBI would trace the forged slips back to him. What none of them knew at the time was that the very first clue had already surfaced. Security footage, grainy but functional, showed the blue panel van with a stenciled Brinks logo slightly tilted to the right, an imperfection that would later catch the eye of investigators. Worse still, a teller on her smoke break swore she had seen the van parked on the corner of Nebraska Avenue 2 days before the heist, as though surveying the bank. It was like they were rehearsing, she told detectives. Though her testimony was dismissed initially as unreliable, it planted the first seed of suspicion that the robbery had been an inside job. By July 12, just 3 days after the heist, the FBI had already subpoenaed payroll records, surveillance logs and delivery slips. They noted discrepancies in Peterson's paperwork and began quietly monitoring his movements. Meanwhile, Brennan's farmhouse hideout grew more tense with each passing hour. At night, the men lay awake listening to the sound of distant sirens, imagining helicopters hovering above. Every crack in the wooden beams, every rustle of the wind through the orange groves, became a potential threat. "We had the money," Callahan later said. "But it was like holding a live grenade." And then, on the fourth night, something happened that would forever fracture their fragile alliance. One of the bags, marked with serial numbers tied directly to the Federal Reserve, went missing from the stash. The disappearance of a single canvas bag, only 40 pounds but containing more than $200,000 in neatly bundled bills, became the spark that ignited suspicion among the 4 men who had just executed one of the most daring heists in American banking history. It was July 13, 1976, only days after the Tampa robbery, and inside the rented farmhouse north of the city, the air was thick with cigarette smoke, paranoia, and unspoken accusations. Thomas Brennan, the Marine veteran who had orchestrated the plan, immediately locked the barn and demanded an explanation. Richard Callahan swore he hadn't touched it, Miguel Ortiz insisted he hadn't moved an inch from his cot, and Harold Peterson, sweating profusely and smelling of whiskey, muttered that perhaps the count was off. But Brennan knew better. The bags had been tallied 3 times, each serial number logged. Someone had broken the first rule, trust, and with that fracture the conspiracy began to unravel even as the FBI tightened its net around them. In Tampa, Special Agent Walter Kruger convened daily briefings inside the FBI field office, a beige building with humming fluorescent lights and the constant shuffle of typewriters. This was no amateur job, Kruger reminded his team. They had insider knowledge. They had timing down to the minute. "We're not looking for desperate junkies here, we're looking for professionals." On the wall behind him, an enlarged map of Tampa showed red pins marking the bank, major highways, and every reported sighting of a suspicious blue panel van. Agents began canvassing auto shops, paint suppliers, and printing companies in search of the poorly stenciled Brinks logo. Meanwhile, they subpoenaed Brinks records, noting that no scheduled delivery matched the timeline of July 9. By July 15, the working theory was clear. The heist had been an inside job, orchestrated with cooperation from at least one bank employee. The pressure on Harold Peterson began almost immediately. Colleagues reported his nervous behavior, the smell of alcohol on his breath, and his sudden request for several days off. FBI agents began following him discreetly, noting his late-night visits to bars, his phone calls from payphones, and his increasingly erratic behavior. "He looked like a man carrying a weight too heavy for his shoulders," one agent wrote in his field notes. Back at the farmhouse, tension boiled over. Brennan demanded that each man empty his belongings, searching pockets, duffel bags, even under floorboards. The missing bag never surfaced. Ortiz accused Peterson outright, his voice sharp with rage. "He's the one with access to the codes, the papers, the goddamn serial numbers. He's the weak link." Peterson, cornered and desperate, shouted back that he had risked everything for them, that without his inside knowledge they would have been caught before they even entered the vault. But Brennan saw in his eyes a crack, a flicker of guilt, and though he said nothing at the time, he quietly resolved that Peterson's fate was sealed if the heat grew any stronger. The irony was that Peterson had not taken the bag, at least not yet. Investigators would later suggest it was Ortiz who had hidden it, testing the loyalty of the group or securing a fallback if things went wrong. The truth remained buried under layers of paranoia, but the effect was the same. Unity fractured, suspicion grew, and the walls began to close in. The FBI's investigation expanded rapidly. Teams interviewed every Brinks driver within 100 miles, cross-referenced their timesheets, and ran forensic analysis on the forged slips. The paper matched stock from a Miami printing press known for serving underworld clients. That led to Ortiz's name surfacing quietly in law enforcement databases, a locksmith with a history of petty theft and suspected ties to Cuban smuggling rings. Simultaneously, financial investigators flagged irregular gambling debts tied to Peterson, noting that his payments to bookies had suddenly stopped after July 9. For Kruger, it was enough to shift strategy. Rather than chase ghosts, they would pressure the weak link. On July 20, Peterson was summoned to FBI headquarters under the pretense of routine questioning. Seated in a sterile interview room, sweating through his shirt, he faced Kruger and two other agents. The questions were calm but relentless. Where were you on the morning of the 9th? Why did your paperwork show inconsistencies? How do you explain the alarm glitch? Peterson denied everything, his voice cracking, his hands trembling. At one point he muttered, "You don't know what it's like, you don't know what I owe," before quickly retracting. The agents had struck a nerve. Though he was released that day, surveillance intensified, and within 48 hours Peterson knew he was being followed. Brennan, sensing the walls closing in, decided to split the cash. On the night of July 22, under cover of darkness, the men divided the bulk of the $8.2 million into separate duffel bags. Brennan kept his share buried under the barn, Callahan transported his portion in the trunk of a Pontiac to a cousin's garage in Orlando, Ortiz drove south toward Miami with bags hidden in hollowed-out crates, and Peterson received the smallest share, handed to him almost like a test. "Keep your mouth shut, keep your head down, and this will all blow over," Brennan told him. But even then trust was gone. Peterson clutched his bag like a drowning man clutching driftwood, fully aware that both sides, the FBI and his accomplices, saw him as disposable. Meanwhile, Tampa reeled. The media painted the heist as both a scandal and a symbol of institutional vulnerability. How could millions vanish under the nose of modern banking security? Television crews interviewed bank customers, retirees whose savings were suddenly in question, union workers who saw the robbery as an act of defiance against corrupt institutions. "It was like Robin Hood, except we didn't see any of the money," one man told a reporter. Yet beneath the sensationalism, fear lingered. If professionals could outwit the system once, what would stop them from doing it again? The investigation took a dramatic turn on August 2, when a fisherman near Cedar Key discovered a single canvas bag floating in the water, torn open, its contents reduced to soggy fragments of cash. The serial numbers matched those of the stolen money. For the FBI, it was confirmation that the loot was being moved. Or discarded. For Brennan and his crew, it was confirmation that someone had broken ranks. Inside the farmhouse, Brennan slammed the newspaper onto the table, glaring at the others. "One of you screwed us," he hissed. Ortiz swore in Spanish, Callahan punched the wall, and Peterson sat silently, eyes darting. The paranoia reached fever pitch. Ortiz demanded they cut ties and scatter permanently. Callahan argued for holding steady, insisting they lay low until the investigation cooled. Brennan, torn between loyalty and survival, began drafting contingency plans. Unknown to the others, he even contacted an old Marine buddy in Louisiana, arranging a possible escape route if everything collapsed. As weeks passed, the FBI built its case methodically. Financial analysis showed Peterson's debts had stopped abruptly, and surveillance captured him entering a motel room with 2 duffel bags. Agents raided the room days later, finding $50,000 in marked bills hidden under the mattress. It wasn't enough to account for his entire share, but it was damning proof. Peterson was arrested on August 15, charged with possession of stolen federal property. Under intense interrogation, he cracked partially, admitting he had knowledge of the robbery but refusing to name his co-conspirators. He described Brennan vaguely as a man with military discipline, and hinted at others from Miami. But he refused to go further, fearful not only of prison but of retribution. Agents sensed he was holding back. "He looked at me like a man already marked for death," Kruger later recalled. The arrest sent shockwaves through the crew. Brennan realized the operation had entered its terminal phase. The FBI now had a thread to pull, and once they tugged hard enough, the entire fabric would unravel. He ordered Callahan and Ortiz to vanish, each taking their cash and severing contact. 4 days, Brennan remained alone at the farmhouse, pacing, drinking coffee, staring at maps of the Gulf Coast. He contemplated fleeing the country, perhaps to Mexico or even Cuba, but he knew the borders were hot, surveillance tight. "It felt like being hunted in a cage," he would later say. In Miami, Ortiz tried to launder his share through underground networks, trading small bundles for gold and offshore accounts. But the sudden influx of marked bills drew suspicion, and soon FBI agents began circling Little Havana, leaning on informants. Callahan, meanwhile, buried his duffel bags on a piece of undeveloped land in Orlando, returning to his construction job as if nothing had happened. Yet neighbors noticed his sudden nervousness, his constant checking of the yard at night. Slowly the web tightened. The most chilling development came in late August, when Peterson, held in federal custody, was found beaten in his cell. Officially, it was described as an altercation with another inmate, but whispers suggested someone on the outside had arranged it, a warning to keep silent. Peterson survived but withdrew further, refusing to cooperate beyond what he had already admitted. The FBI realized they were racing against time, not only to recover the money but to prevent bloodshed. As summer turned to fall, the case grew into a national obsession. Time magazine ran a cover story titled, "The Great Florida Heist," speculating about mafia involvement, Cuban exile networks, even corrupt law enforcement. Inside Tampa, the First National Bank installed new security systems and held public meetings to reassure customers, but the damage was done. Trust in the institution had been shattered. Then came the breakthrough. Forensic technicians analyzing the forged Brinks slips discovered a faint fingerprint on the margin of one sheet. Running it through FBI records produced a match: Miguel Ortiz, arrested years earlier in Miami on burglary charges. Suddenly, the nameless shadow became a suspect with a history. Warrants were issued, surveillance expanded, and within weeks Ortiz was spotted in Miami trying to arrange a flight to Panama under a false passport. On September 12, 1976, he was arrested at Miami International Airport, carrying a suitcase containing $300,000 in marked bills. His capture was a major victory for the FBI, but Brennan and Callahan remained at large, their millions hidden, their loyalty uncertain. The pressure cooker was now at its peak. Brennan, hiding in Louisiana under an assumed name, wrote letters to his wife in Tampa, letters later recovered that revealed a man torn between pride and despair. "We did something the world will never forget," he wrote in one, "but the price is heavier than any bag of cash." Callahan, by contrast, grew colder, more ruthless, speaking openly to friends about leaving the country permanently. By October, both men were ghosts, their trail reduced to whispers, while Peterson languished in custody and Ortiz faced federal charges. Yet one mystery remained unsolved. Of the $8.2 million stolen, only a fraction had been recovered. The rest had vanished into hidden caches, offshore accounts, or perhaps the muddy swamps of Central Florida. And as winter approached, investigators feared they were running out of leads. Then in early November, a tip arrived that would change everything. A local farmer claimed he had seen men digging near an abandoned orange grove outside Orlando late at night. Agents rushed to the site, and what they unearthed would not only confirm suspicions but ignite a chain of events leading directly to the final downfall of Brennan and Callahan. Under the gray morning sky, the house deep in the forest stood like a relic that had swallowed time itself, its windows empty, its roof sagging, its doors chained with rust. But inside, the four who had vanished weeks before were still there, caught in a strange routine that neither resembled captivity nor freedom. And as investigators searched for traces across the mountains, the truth of their days in that place unfolded in silence. They woke to the sound of creaking beams and dripping water each morning. The man who had once been a mechanic tried to keep track of time by scratching lines into the wall, though the marks blurred into each other until days became indistinguishable. The woman spent hours at the small window staring at the endless woods beyond, convinced she could almost see the same paths they had walked before disappearing. But when she blinked, the vision dissolved into nothing. The two younger men alternated between hope and despair, their voices sometimes loud, sometimes hushed, but always filled with the weight of questions they could not answer. Who had brought them here? Why had they been left alive? Why was the house stocked with just enough food and water to keep them breathing, but never enough to feel secure outside? The air smelled of pine and damp earth, yet stepping out was forbidden. The first time they tried the door, it was locked from the outside, and though they searched for hidden exits or loose floorboards, they found nothing, only the sense that the house itself was alive, breathing slowly with them, its walls expanding and contracting in the silence. Nights were the worst. The forest grew louder, shadows pressed against the broken shutters, and sometimes a light flickered far among the trees as if someone stood watching with a lantern. But when morning came, no trace remained. Their memories of the mountain trip that had led them here blurred with every passing day, details slipping away until only fragments remained: a campfire, the sound of rushing water, laughter before sleep, then nothing. The woman began to write messages with charcoal on scraps of wood, whispering that someone might one day find them. The mechanic guarded these scraps like treasure, hiding them beneath loose stones, though none of them could say why. Perhaps they hoped for discovery, perhaps they only wanted proof that they had once been real people beyond these walls. Meanwhile, far away, the families who searched refused to believe the official reports that declared the four likely Dead searches extended across valleys, rivers, and old mining trails, but always stopped short of the deep forest where the house stood because no maps showed a path leading there. Investigators traced odd sightings of figures moving near logging roads, but evidence dissolved into rumor, and yet the house remained undisturbed, standing like a secret woven into the land. Weeks stretched into months. The captives' bodies grew thin, their voices softer, yet something inside them hardened. The mechanics. Scratches on the wall no longer marked days but patterns, shapes that might have been maps or warnings. The woman's notes became longer, more desperate, telling stories of how they had tried to remember their lives outside, names of children, jobs, favorite songs. The two younger men who once argued fell silent, listening instead for the footsteps they sometimes swore they heard outside the door. And then one night the footsteps came closer, slow, deliberate, across the porch. The lock clicked, metal against metal, but the door did not open. Instead, a paper slid under it, a single sheet folded twice. They waited until the sound retreated into the trees before touching it. The paper bore only coordinates scrawled in black ink. Shaking, they realized the numbers marked a place nearly 100 kilometers from where they had begun the trip, the same distance investigators later would measure when the house was finally discovered, abandoned months later, empty but with those same notes and markings left behind. Untouched, the truth of how the four were moved from mountain to forest and why they were kept alive remained hidden, but the signs they left carried their fear across time. The strange mixture of survival and silence, etched into wood and paper and scratched walls, told of an unseen presence that had orchestrated everything yet never revealed itself. And so the mystery lingered, not only in the forest house but in the hearts of those who searched for answers, never knowing if the missing four had ever truly escaped or if the house still held them in ways no one could measure. When investigators finally reached the forest house months after the disappearance, it stood exactly as if frozen in time, the air inside heavy with damp and rot, yet every object seemed placed with intention. On the crooked table lay the scraps of wood where the woman had scrawled her desperate words, while the mechanic's marks etched into the plastered wall stretched like veins, reaching upward then twisting into symbols that no one could immediately interpret. Some of the younger officers dismissed them as delirious scratches made during captivity, but the older detective leading the search refused to overlook the patterns. He traced them carefully and realized they aligned with constellations visible only in late autumn. The timing suggested that whoever left them had kept track of the sky even without clocks or calendars, which meant the captives had never surrendered to confusion entirely. The beds were unmade, blankets thin but still folded with care. Near the hearth, small remnants of burned paper clung to the ashes as if someone had tried to destroy evidence, yet fragments remained, numbers, dates, initials partially legible, and it was enough to feed the suspicion that this was not just a place of holding but a place of message. The detective gathered every piece into sealed bags, though unease clung to him like the damp air. He could not shake the sensation that the four had not been trapped here by accident. The supplies left in the cupboards were rationed too precisely: rice, beans, water in glass containers, each portion calculated to sustain life but not to comfort. It suggested observation, calculation, even an experiment. And though the house bore no sign of chains, locks, or weapons, the feeling of invisible control was everywhere. Outside, the soil carried prints but not human ones. The pattern resembled machinery tracks or heavy carts dragged through mud, yet the path ended abruptly as though something had lifted away from the ground. The detective followed these faint impressions deep into the trees until they dissolved into moss, but even then he swore the silence of the forest felt staged, as if the woods themselves were listening back. In the village, families clung to hope, yet each official report grew colder, each explanation leaning toward accident or madness, yet none accounted for how the four people could vanish on a mountain path and be found 2 months later inside a house 100 kilometers away, their belongings discovered scattered in ways too deliberate to be coincidence. The detective returned to the house night after night, refusing to close the case. He sat in the rotting kitchen, listening to the creaks and watching the window for the flicker of lantern light the survivors had once described. Though he never saw it himself, he believed them, because in the silence he too began to feel watched, as though the house itself remembered its occupants and waited for their return. The fifth stage of the story began with the detective's decision to push beyond protocol and conduct his own inquiry into the strange disappearance and reappearance of the four missing travelers. He pored over the notes the woman had written on scraps of wood and the ash fragments salvaged from the hearth in the abandoned house, assembling them like pieces of a puzzle. Though much of the writing was incomplete, he noticed a repeated phrase carved into both paper and plaster. It read, "Not yet," and the simplicity of those words unsettled him more than any desperate plea for help, because it suggested that the captives had been waiting for something, an event or a signal rather than escape. He began interviewing locals in nearby hamlets, focusing on old hunters and foresters who knew the terrain. One man recalled hearing distant hammering in the woods during the weeks the four had been missing. Another swore he had seen lights hovering low above the trees at night, but when pressed for details both Retreated into silence as if afraid of ridicule or something worse. The detective mapped the supposed locations of these sightings, and to his unease they aligned in a rough circle around the forest house as though the building were the center of a pattern he could not yet decode. Meanwhile, pressure from higher authorities increased. They wanted the case closed as an accident and warned him not to waste resources on what they called superstition, but he could not ignore the evidence. Each mark in the plaster, each number written in half-burned ink, spoke of design, not chaos. He returned again to the house, this time alone, and as he traced the star-like patterns scratched into the wall, he realized they did not only mirror constellations but also pointed toward the very coordinates found on the folded sheet left beneath the locked door, the same coordinates where nothing had been discovered before. He resolved to travel there himself, though the journey would take him deeper into the forest than most dared to go. With every step he felt the weight of the missing four pressing against him, not just as victims but as witnesses of something larger, something that had moved them across impossible distance and left them alive only long enough to write fragments of warning. Not yet. The words haunted him as he pushed forward, convinced that the answer waited in the silence of that coordinate point, a silence that had already swallowed others and threatened now to swallow him too. The detective set out before dawn, carrying little more than a compass, a lantern, and the coordinates that had been slipped under the door of the house where the four captives once lived their silent days. He moved deeper into the forest than any official search had dared, the trees closing in around him as if forming a barrier that tested his resolve. Every step forward felt heavier, the soil damp with roots like veins tugging at his boots. The deeper he went, the quieter the woods became, until even birdsong ceased and the silence pressed against his ears like water. Hours passed until at last he reached the marked point. It was nothing but a clearing ringed by pines, the ground bare as though something massive had once rested there. He examined the soil and found it disturbed in wide, perfect arcs as though machinery had pressed down and lifted away without leaving tracks. Beyond the clearing the earth grew harder and untouched, no sign of movement leading in or out. It was a place of arrival but not of departure. Standing there he recalled the scattered testimonies of lights above the trees and realized the patterns on the plaster wall in the abandoned house might not only mimic stars but trace trajectories across the sky. He dropped to his knees to study the ground more closely and discovered small shards of glassy stone half buried, their surfaces scorched and unfamiliar. They looked neither natural nor man-made, yet they lay scattered in deliberate symmetry circling the clearing. He pocketed one and felt an odd warmth in it, pulsing faintly as though alive. A chill went through him, but he did not drop it. Instead he marked the location and began the trek back. Night fell fast, the forest swallowing what little light remained, and for a moment he swore he heard footsteps behind him, steady, measured, keeping pace. But when he turned nothing stirred, only the darkness pressing closer. He quickened his pace, his lantern flickering, and by the time he emerged from the trees near the house he felt the weight of unseen eyes on his back, as though the forest itself had judged him. He entered the house again and placed the shard beside the burned fragments of paper, noting how the faint glow seemed to bring the ash letters into sharper relief, almost readable, almost revealing what the missing four had tried to warn but still fractured. The words not yet clearer than ever, as if waiting for him to understand that whatever force had moved them across 100 kilometers had not finished its design, and that he now stood closer to the center of it than he had ever intended.